afternoon, everyone. Really excited for you to join us for the February Children's Women's Research Lunch and Learn. And thanks so much for allowing us to do a little last minute reschedule. I'm really excited to announce today's presenter. Nicole Prestley is the Research and Knowledge Translation Manager at the Women's Health Research Institute and an amazing colleague of mine. Nicole has been with the WHRI for over 10 years and has worked as a healthcare research facilitator and patient partner liaison for 2006. We'll pass things over to Nicole to present her Beyond the Binary work, which I've been hearing about for some time now and really excited to hear more about it. Over to you, Nicole.
Thanks so much, Shanley, and thank you everyone for coming today. I'm really excited. It's not my work, it's the work that this guide has been a culmination of just a lot of people's energy and experiences trying to do better. And so I'm really excited to present our first final product, our first version of a product to you today. Before or as I get started, I'm just gonna take a minute and acknowledge that I'm an uninvited settler on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And as a member of a provincial health research institute, we are committed to improving the health and health outcomes of women, including those across the 2S LGBTQIA+ spectrum. And we recognize our collective efforts and responsibility towards establishing culturally safe healthcare systems as well as services, and the role of research in informing those safer systems and services. And in particular, we do want to acknowledge those health inequities among Indigenous people, especially Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. We encourage all folks engaged in research to read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls to action, as well as the In Plain Sight report. And in addition to this sort of calling in, I'd also like to continue a practice that some colleagues of mine have started, Rosie Toomey and Beth Payne, who have started showcasing literature that can support decolonizing efforts in our research practice. And so this one that I've got here today is one related to knowledge mobilization, which is a part of my role at the Women's Health Research Institute. And something that I really wanted to highlight from this article is the 5 principles of knowledge mobilization that were illustrated in this article around engagement, reciprocity, co-creation, power, and people-specific. And these actually tie in really well to some of our work for on the Beyond the Binary project. So you'll see that kind of pop up over the next hour. What we'll do this afternoon is give you a history. I will give you a history of Beyond the Binary in BC. I'll touch on the process, give you an overview of the guide, and talk about our future goals and future work. These are 5 of the many humans that have been a part of this project. These are the folks that I'm referring to when I say our core team. Dr. Angela Kaida and BC Pomeroy were our project, our research co-leads on the project. Dr. Lori Brotto, who's our Women's Health Research Institute executive director, was also sort of our executive sponsor for the project, acknowledging this was an institute-led initiative. And then myself and Julia Santana Perea were the project support leads. And I do want to acknowledge Stephanie Scortes, who stepped in my absence while I was tending to tiny humans for 10 months, or one of the tiny humans for 10 months. And she took on my role. we are, that last slide was 5 people of many. This is sort of a summary of all of the people and organizations who were a part of this project. As you'll see on the left, these are all of the organizational logos that I could find. And then this acknowledgement section from the guide itself has a list of all the names of the individuals who consented to being recognized. And these are folks who participated on our committees, as well as some of the WHRI staff who really catalyzed this work, and I'll talk about them in a minute. And some of the UBC departments, because we did just put the UBC logo in there, that were represented were OBGYN, nursing, the Office of Research Ethics was represented, as well as the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And what I hope you're going to leave with today is an understanding of the Beyond the Binary in BC process and project, an understanding of our intended use of the guide, as well as some awarenesses or some awareness of paradigms and practices to support research team learning around gender inclusive language. How it started, some of you may have heard this story before, and I apologize for the duplication if you have, but it really started with 2 staff, Franny McKenzie and Melissa Nelson, who worked for the WHRI. And they collectively noted an increase in requests for inclusive language, gender inclusive language in Franny's case, in recruitment material, in Melissa's case, in more of the scientific communication as we were reporting results. And we had a unique experience with then family planning fellow, Dr. Michelle Chan, who was in that boat of trying to really understand how to be inclusive in her recruitment material, looking at in the space of emergency contraception. And Michelle ended up getting feedback on her recruitment material that just signaled that it was a good idea to have these reflections on language. And so we thought we would write a story about this experience. And we collaborated with AJ Murray from BC Women's Hospital and AJ Lowick from the Center for Gender and Sexual Health Equity. And we kind of wrote up what we did and this experience. And this web story ended up being one of the most popular pages on our website for a few years running. And so this, in culmination with Franny and Melissa receiving these requests, really led us to realize there was a gap. And so what they did was the sort of timeline for this work. We released 2 web stories with the Beyond the Binary theme. And concurrent with that, Franny and Melissa had started compiling resources to support these language requests. And what we found was that there was very little, actually nothing, in the context of research. A lot of the resources that were built were sort of built for more frontline clinical care settings. And so we decided to mobilize as many research collaborators as we could and submit a Michael Smith Health Research BC or Michael Smith Health Research BC Convening and Collaborating Award, which we were successful with in 2021. And as you can see from our timeline, quotations there, there has been nothing linear about the work. So what happened after 2021? So as I introduce the Beyond the Binary in BC project, I do want to acknowledge that people across the gender spectrum can benefit from research framed as women's health. And so this project really explored not only how we can avoid exclusion, but create space and inclusion for trans, non-binary, gender diverse, and intersex folks. And what this meant for us as a team embarking on this work is acknowledging that many of these folks have experienced harm from research within the health system. They've experienced misgendering, stigma, discrimination, and exclusion, and that we needed to acknowledge and address that harm. And that's why we pulled in the patient or person-oriented and trauma-informed approaches to our work. We had 3 goals for the project. The first was to establish and convene a community steering committee, which at this point, we had BC Pomeroy, who is a trauma and resiliency informed practice expert who, so they were sort of the natural fit to lead some of this engagement work, but these were people that we were going to be engaging for the first time. This wasn't a group that we had formed yet. The second goal was to convene and engage research partners in training opportunities. So these research partners are what we would call now our research steering committee. These are folks who were mostly the collaborators on the C² application. And then our third goal was to host knowledge exchange events to facilitate a dialogue around gender equitable research practice. Our processes, so we started with just sort of a literature review to see how particularly women's health researchers were accounting for sex and gender in their work. We also did an environmental scan of BC just to ensure we weren't duplicating any existing efforts. And I do want to mention that these 2 pieces were supported by some trainees on the project who are all listed on our website as well. The committee engagement, this was really what kind of showed us the barriers and facilitators to this work and have led to what we have today in the Beyond the Binary in BC guide. This is what the sort of formation of the people looked like. And it's funny, when you go into Canva, you look for all of these different ways of showing committees and structures and org charts, and nothing quite fits with what we did and how we operated. So I finessed this together. So you saw the picture of our core team, myself, Julia, Angela, BC, and Lori. And we kind of acted in dyads. So myself and Angela supported the RSC, our research steering committee, whereas BC and Julia really supported the engagement and running of the community steering committee. And the design of this, the reason why you don't see the 2 steering committees overlap, that's intentional. That's because the community steering committee did indicate to us a preference of having more of a putting the responsibility on us to communicate their feedback to the research committee and vice versa. So we would always start with the community steering committee, get their feedback. We would act as communications liaisons to the research steering committee, and the cycle would kind of go back and forth. Now, near the end of the project, the 2 groups did converge and meet with one another at everyone's request to kind of celebrate what we had accomplished. The composition of the research steering committee, we had, great representation. We had research trainees, researchers. We had folks across basic science, clinical research, social sciences, folks in midwifery, OBGYN, sexual health, pop and public health. I think we even had infectious disease folks there. We had leaders from BC Children's Hospital Research Institute, Women's Health Research Institute, folks from PHSA. We also had folks from BC Women's Hospital who are in the sort of knowledge translation space. We had folks from research ethics at UBC, and we also had research staff members who we know kind of support a lot of the language work within the research projects, whether they're helping inform REB applications or recruitment material, as well as writing up results. Our researcher activities included regular meetings. So this would be where we would set priorities. At the start, we reaffirmed our priorities, as well as the project scope. We also, really importantly, I do want to call out the trainings. Some of our RSC members came with extensive training, and others not so much. And so what we wanted to do was really put everyone on an equal footing before we engaged in any deep conversations about how to support this work. And so we offered folks 2 different courses. One was the Intro to Gender Diversity course offered by PHSA, which really introduces key terms and concepts along with simple strategies for creating gender affirming services. The second was through Vancouver Coastal Health. They offer PRISM training to any research folks as well. And the training's called Trans Inclusion 101. The focus is on enhancing awareness, compassion, and competencies when working with trans folks. And then we did a KT workshop. So this was comprised of a reflexivity exercise. So kind of acknowledging our own positionality and power and influence in research, and critically reflect on what we're doing and what we're trying to accomplish and why. And then it also fed into more practical KT activities like key messages that we want to draw from this work, as well as knowledge translation strategies. Julia and BC led the community engagement, and in that sort of introductory space, you saw that we took trauma and resiliency informed approach, as well as a patient or person-centered approach. Throughout their engagement, they also added a justice-oriented approach, so called that in through the community feedback. Bev themselves, I think I mentioned, is a TRIP expert, which is the acronym for Trauma and Resiliency Informed Practice. And so, you know, the reason why they added the justice-oriented approach to their to the engagement was to really name and account for the systemic discrimination for folks who the communities that were engaging in the project. The 6 principles of TRIP, I do want to mention this, just tying back into the land acknowledgement and the paper that I referenced. The 6 principles of TRIP that Julia and BC kind of brought into this space are trauma awareness, safety and trustworthiness, opportunities for choice, collaboration and connection, strengths-based, decolonizing practice, and meaningful involvement of people with living and lived experiences. And so really the hope by taking all of these concepts was to mitigate to the best of anyone's ability, because BC will tell me you can never guarantee safety, but to mitigate to the best of our ability harm or even reharming communities when we're asking them to partner on research. And this is really acknowledging, going back to us acknowledging the systemic harm that many of these folks have experienced to date. And this was carried through into the community activities. So the sort of grounding of the community engagement once the outreach was complete was the coming together. What they did was they created terms of reference, which might sound like a simple task, but this is really a space where you can apply those concepts of TRIP, those principles of TRIP in what you're asking people to do, how their information might be used, how long, time commitments, supports offered. And one of the outputs to this grounding was also a self-care support resource. So acknowledging that as our community members who represent people who have faced and supported communities that face gender-based inequities, is they may be triggered by these conversations that they're going to have. And so making sure that we're giving them appropriate supports to take care of themselves throughout this work. The meetings, the regular meetings, were spaces where they reviewed content and would sort of, at least for things like the example scenarios in the glossary that you see in the guide, this is where discussions happened around the terms, the concepts, and why these terms and concepts are important, as well as where we really learned the importance of community-generated references. And I'll touch on that a little bit later as I give you a tour of the guide. And then this third sort of activity was really the culmination of, or I guess the end of the C² application, or the C² project, where we did have a chance to have the research steering committee and the community steering committee join one another, and they now continue to collaborate, which is why you see those arrows leading to the bottom. The composition of the steering committee, there were 12 members. There were folks who were two-spirit, trans, non-binary, as well as cisgender. It was comprised of care providers, community organizers, people receiving gender-affirming care, as well as educators. Oh, sorry. And so throughout sort of our engagement and activities, there were a few key lessons that I just want to highlight. These are by no means exhaustive, but I do think they dovetail nicely into what you'll see with the guide, as well as things that I hope stick. The first is that there's no consensus on terminology, and this will feed into language, why it matters, and how we as a research community kind of need to account for that. That most of the resources that we saw through this process were in more urban areas, dedicated to frontline work, so not focused on a research setting, let alone a women's health research setting, which was our scope. Number 3 is an important one. This is representing commitments to equity and justice. This is the voice of community. These commitments need to be continuous, and these need to be things that the research community has capacity to support. And then last but certainly not least is responsiveness. So to experiences, that it must be adaptive, not prescriptive. So building in agility to changes in language over time, changes in knowledge over time, is something that we do need to think about as we continue to support this work. So our timeline, this is a very, very busy slide. We encountered a variety of roadblocks along the way that we needed to just pivot. And so at the time that we came to March 2023, from where we started, we didn't have the full intention of producing a knowledge product at this level. Our goal was really to form partnerships, understand barriers and facilitators, and map forward what we could do to account for that. But throughout this engagement process, the knowledge was shared and resources were received. And so by the end of March 2023, we had a series of Google Docs and as well as Google Sheets, where we had stored all of this information. And what we realized was this probably wasn't very usable for the research community. And so over the next year, We hired a contractor to take some of this knowledge and put it into a format that was hopefully more usable for you folks. And so this is it. This is the front page of the guide for those who haven't been on the website. And thanks, Ashley, for putting the link in the chat. This is the Beyond the Binary in BC cover page. And I just want to take a second and really say thank you to Melissa Nelson, who we re-engaged to support this work. Melissa was there at the start, and she was there supporting sort of design. And everything in this guide is intentional, even from the cover page and this coastline of our province, where you know, she did want to represent that this work is not linear, that there is that this work is across a spectrum, and so there's nuances to the artwork and the design. And so I'd love to give you a tour. What I'm going to do is really just give you an overview of the different sections and let you know what you can expect within each one. So there's 7 sections in total. The executive summary is a must read. This is an absolute. This gives you an overview of the project. The language matters section is a deep dive into why we're really trying to go beyond using the right words. The example scenarios, these are community informed. These pull in glossary terms and concepts and put them into sort of a real world setting. The principles and practices, this is about those concepts like reflexivity, TRIP, justice-oriented approaches, to just help you build some foundational knowledge, as well as give you some ways to apply that knowledge. The glossary is where we house all of these terms and concepts, as well as the links to the resources. The resource library is a work in process. We haven't had the chance to engage Melissa in this yet, but it's really a summary of all of the Lit Search, environmental scan, and other articles that we've kind of encountered over time. And then, of course, our references to cite our work. So the executive summary, I'd like to think about this as like, if you only have 5 minutes, read this. It's a necessary read at the beginning. It gives you an overview of our process. We haven't published a process paper or report yet, but happy to always share more about our process. And this is obviously relevant for any folks who want to replicate these kinds of activities in their own research setting. It has some key messages about that you can draw out of the project, as well as the scope and limitations, are known limitations, obviously. So the guide itself is focused on gender-based inequities, which we don't want to be conflated with biological sex-based differences in health experiences and outcomes, though both sex and gender are important. And we do actually have an example scenario within the guide that integrate both sex and gender. So I do encourage you to check that out. Language matters. This section talks about the different approaches to language, why language matters, and the role of intersectionality. And so for folks who are maybe just new to this space, there's 3 main approaches to language that we're aware of. Each approach has its implications and limitations. The gender additive approach, which is the one that we use in our example scenarios, it intentionally names the gender of participants for whom the research is relevant. So it's thought that the naming of women sort of acknowledges the years of advocacy to have women, to have people who are assigned female at birth recognized as people who should be included in research, and as people who have particular physiological and developmental differences. Now, there's also gender neutral and anatomy-based approaches, and these can be used to mitigate assumptions about gender. Now, there are some organizations who support this language approach. There are some who have expressed dissatisfaction. The folks who express dissatisfaction, you know, we've heard that that comes from, it can be dehumanizing. There's also particular considerations for women of color. And so we do need to think about the use of gender neutral and anatomical language in the context of historical racism, ongoing racism, as well as colonization. And so really, when thinking about our language, you know, the fact that we have 3 approaches to language tells us about the importance of the context in which you use the language and why that's important. In addition to that context, thinking about accessibility, thinking about how well that language translates, thinking about people's knowledge of their own anatomy are all important considerations before choosing an approach to language. Now, we included intersectionality in this section because people don't experience gender in a vacuum. You know, I can acknowledge that I am a cis white, I'm a white cisgender woman. And so my relationship to doing this work and experiencing gender inequities is very different. And so acknowledging my own identities and how they intersect with one another can also help us sort of understand our own relationship to the work we do and account for those. And this really ties into the section after the next one, which is paradigms and practices. And above all, like what we hope folks are going to take out of this section is that language is impactful. I think many of us who are exposed to the news have seen that language can harm. We know language can exclude. We also know language can harm people. We also know that language can help, and language can include and create inclusion if it's used appropriately. Language is also changing, and just over time we've seen terms come and go, and so just thinking about the agility that we need to have in order to respond to that changing language. And going back into that intersectionality space and thinking about different identities, different contexts, that language differs, and the needs of that language are going to differ with the community and the context that it's set within. Our example scenarios, these are exactly what you might imagine. They are examples set within different phases of the research process. So proposal development, recruitment, data collection, analysis, and outcomes reporting. And these aren't meant to be prescriptive. What these are meant to do is give you a sense of how a research team might arrive at a decision to use particular language. This calls in glossary terms. It also calls in practices of reflexivity and community engagement, which is really, again, it's not a cookie cutter example that just because you're doing a similar project, you want to do exactly the same thing. It's about showcasing the practice of reflexivity and community engagement to help you get at the inclusive recruitment material that you might want or proposal that you might want. paradigms and practices. This section goes through definitions of reflexivity, what it is, the connection to positionality. It provides an overview of some resources and activities to support reflexivity, and then provides an overview of those justice-oriented approaches. So anti-oppressive, culturally safe, equity-oriented, and trauma and resiliency informed. So just providing some foundational knowledge about those concepts. And so what is reflexivity? It's the practice of locating ourselves within research, social, and cultural contexts. And so similar to, us acknowledging, me acknowledging that I'm an uninvited settler on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. These are things that that are examples of reflexivity, and the hope of reflexivity is that we start to see the positions that we hold, and we can account for some of our conscious and unconscious biases that we may be bringing into our work, and in this case, into our research projects. And this, so this is one exercise that I just wanted to highlight, that's from the Intersectionality and Knowledge Translation Reflection workbook by KT Canada. So this is something we can practice within our teams, talk about or articulate our identities, and then ask ourselves these questions. What assumptions are you making, or what do you think you already know about the research focus? Or about the people it impacts? Sometimes we can uncover that we actually have biases about the population that we are studying. And hopefully it's not studying, hopefully it's working with. You can ask yourself, what expectations or fears are you holding about the research? How are your hopes, desires, expectations, and fears influenced by your positionality? So are we sometimes holding on to certain power that we have? And I just wanted to share an example of an exercise that we did. This wasn't around language in particular, but it was in a women's health context. So there's a project that I support called Understanding Drivers to Non-Medically Indicated Cesarean Section Delivery Choice amongst first-time birthers at BC Women's. And something that we realized as a team engaging in this work was that we all had different identities and also judgments. There were identities of service providers, so OBGYNs. There are folks who have had non-medically indicated C-sections. And we realized that some of those negative judgments about people choosing non-medically indicated C-sections, as well as folks who had non-medically indicated C-sections, could negatively impact or show up as biases in how we onboard patient partners, how we present a patient partner opportunity, as well as how we write our interview guide or show our recruitment material. And so we had a facilitated discussion as a group. We've been honest about our experiences and our identities, and we have checkpoints with one another, and have we endeavor to create just a really open and honest research space where we can continue to account for these identities and experiences. So some considerations for application: if BC Pomeroy was here today, they would say anytime is a good time to start, but ideally you start to think about these concepts during the ideation phase. It really helps you account for who might be missing on your team, what perspectives aren't represented, and and this and this is sort of the I just want to fold this into these 3 screenshots from the guide around anti-oppressive research. And what this means is really challenging the status quo. And so something that we've seen in just this beyond the binary work is that tension with health research that we all have, which, we use words like protocol and adherence. And when we hear things like we have to be agile and responsive, that can be a shift for us. That can feel different. And so how do we account for those tensions? The equity-oriented approach. So this is where things like reflexivity can really step in and help us kind of acknowledge the power dynamic and account for that. And then the 6 guiding principles of TRIP. The glossary, this, I think I have talked a bit about this. Something that I really want to just highlight here is the fact that these concepts and terms were community generated. There's a variety of glossaries that exist. I think how this one stands out is that engagement with community. In particular, the way that the community terms and concepts were referenced. Something that came out of the engagement is that we had a tendency on the research side to reference health organizations, as well as organizations who, have been known to systemically harm people who, are experiencing gender-based inequities. These organizations have also been a part of colonization. And so the CSC really taught us to look deeper into the organizations that are at the forefront of supporting these concepts, supporting communities, developing the terminology, because they do exist, and we needed to do better at finding them and referencing them for the work that they've done. The resource library. So yeah, as I mentioned, this is sort of our the space where we have our the results from the literature search and the environmental scan. And this is really a work in progress. So this is literally a Google sheet organized in a methodical way. So you're welcome to poke around in there. And we are looking for different ways to kind of maintain and showcase this information. So you may be thinking, what can I do? There's kind of 3 takeaways that we're hoping folks leave with. One is to reflect on the language that you use throughout the research process to make sure you're not unintentionally excluding people from both participating in the research, but also benefiting from the research results. The second is to meaningfully engage people and communities whose identities and experiences, not just that you don't share them, but maybe they aren't represented at the table and they deserve to be. And meaningful engagement, I do acknowledge that can seem like a vague concept. Meaningful engagement takes resources, which we know are hard to find. It also takes time. It also can be supported by some of those concepts that BC and Julia used for their community engagement. So looking at things like justice-oriented approaches, as well as TRIP and patient and person-oriented research. And last, practicing reflexivity. So using some of these exercises that are in the guide within your own research team to really help work towards a new culture of research, where we are kind of aware of what influences what research gets prioritized, who gets a seat at the table. And this, it's just a reminder to folks, and there's two quotes I wanted to share with you that really just stood out from the project. This is from one of our community steering committee members, Elder Sandy Leo. You have to go slow to go far. We can feel very rushed sometimes there may be some of you who are frantically putting together, your project grant applications. Slow down, take a deep breath, and let's represent the relationships at the stage they're at. And see how far we can go. The other piece that really came out from the community steering committee is, there's different approaches to language. There's cultural context. There's context, and it's always best to ask people. So just not making assumptions, making sure we're asking people how they want to be identified or described. So what now? As an organization, as a representative of the WHRI, we are committed to sort of stewardship of this guide and the information over time. And we want to make sure that it meets the needs of our community. We also we want to do two things. We want to make sure it's usable to the research community. We also want to make sure that that community voice is preserved. And so over the next few months, we'll be doing additional knowledge translation work as we try to get it into the hands of the research community at large. But for your own takeaways, we'd love it if you read it cover to cover and share it with your research team. We'd love it if you would try a reflexivity exercise within your team. We'd also love your feedback. The feedback, what we are hoping is that over time, we can compile feedback and we can make changes in sort of a bulk setting to the guide so that we're continuing to be responsive to both community voice and our researcher needs, or research community needs. This is a continuation of the project. So as you can see, we had the guide creation, that little 2024, we're here. You'll see a little offshoot here. What's another beautiful thing that's happened from this project is we've now gone national. In 2023, we applied for a planning and dissemination grant to take the BC guide, and in collaboration with the Partnership for Women's Health Research Canada, POWER is the acronym, we've now mobilized all the Women's Health Research Institutes in Canada to form a researcher task force and a community task force. And both those groups are providing input on the guide on how we can make it more relevant to a Canadian audience. Now, this doesn't mean we're forgetting about the BC guide. We'll continue to tailor and adapt that guide. But this is work that's kind of sprouted from our provincial work. So with that, I'll close things off and just say thank you so much for your time today and your interest in the project. I'm sure folks are sick of hearing me talk about it and perhaps happy or relieved that they can just look at a document instead of hearing me bring it up at staff meetings or other meetings that we sit at tables with. The other thing I wanted to mention is just thank you to all of those folks that have contributed to this project. It truly has taken a community of human beings to get us to where we're at today. And I'm sure it'll continue to take that to make this work meaningful and relevant to folks who experience gender-based inequities, as well as make it usable to our research community. So thank you so much, and do connect with me. My email is up here. I can pop it in the chat.